In May of 1941, the war for Great Britain was a war of pure survival. The island nation was standing alone, and it was being strangled. In the vast, cold expanse of the North Atlantic, German U-boats, the wolf packs, were hunting in groups, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of the vital food, fuel, and weapons that Britain needed to live. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, and Britain was losing. And then, on May 18th, 1941, the German Navy unleashed its new king. It was a weapon so powerful, so fast, and so technologically advanced that it was designed to end the Battle of the Atlantic in a single, decisive campaign. It was not a U-boat. It was the Bismarck. This was, at the time, the largest, most powerful, and most feared warship on the planet. It was a 50,000-ton monster of steel and firepower. 823 feet long, it was a super-battleship. It was, in every sense of the word, a sea fortress. Its armor was over 12 inches thick, designed to be immune to any shell the British Royal Navy could fire at it. Its guns were a technological marvel. It carried 8 15-inch cannons in 4 massive radar-controlled turrets. They were the most accurate naval guns in the world. They could hurl a 1,800-pound armor-piercing shell over 22 miles and hit a target on the first salvo. But its greatest weapon was its speed. The Bismarck could do over 30 knots, 35 miles per hour. This was the impossible problem for the British Admiralty. The Bismarck was faster than every single battleship in the British Home Fleet, and it was stronger than every British cruiser that was fast enough to catch it. It was a fox in a world of hounds and turtles. The British fleet was a collection of proud but aging World War I era veterans. They were slow. Their guns were less accurate. The Bismarck could, quite literally, run circles around them. It could pick its fights, destroy any ship smaller than it, and simply outrun any ship that was strong enough to hurt it. And now, this invincible monster, under the command of Admiral Gunther Lütjens, had just left its safe harbour in Norway. It was accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. Its mission was codenamed Operation Rheinübung. Its goal was not to fight the Royal Navy. That was a bonus. Its real goal was to break out, undetected, into the vast open hunting grounds of the North Atlantic and to annihilate the convoys. It was a commerce raider, a 50,000-ton pirate ship that no one could stop. In London, at the Admiralty, the mood was not just concern. It was pure, cold, existential panic. Winston Churchill knew that if the Bismarck broke into the open Atlantic, the lifeline would not just be cut, it would be destroyed. The war would be over. He gave a simple, desperate order to the entire home fleet: find the Bismarck at all costs. The hunt was on. The British knew there were only 2 gates the Bismarck could use to escape: the gap between Iceland and Greenland, or the gap between Iceland and Scotland, known as the Denmark Strait. Patrolling this cold, fog-filled 200-mile-wide gate of the Denmark Strait was the pride of the British Navy, the H.M.S. Hood. The Hood was a legend. For 20 years, it was the largest, most beautiful, and most famous warship in the world. It was the mighty Hood, and it was sailing directly, at high speed, into a trap. The H.M.S. Hood was in 1941 the single most powerful symbol of the Royal Navy, but she had a secret, fatal flaw. She was not a true battleship. She was a battle cruiser built 20 years earlier. She had the speed and the guns of a battleship. but she had the armor of a cruiser. Her decks, in particular, were dangerously thin, a relic of an older era of naval warfare. Sailing with the Hood was the brand new, cutting-edge battleship, H.M.S. Prince of Wales. This was a modern ship designed to fight the Bismarck, but it was so new that it had sailed into combat with civilian contractors still on board, trying to fix its guns, which kept jamming. This was the force the British were sending, a flawed legend and a half-broken rookie. In the cold, grey dawn of May the 24th, 1941, in the Denmark Strait, the British found them. The Bismarck and the Prince Eugen appeared as silhouettes against the ice. The British Admiral, Lancelot Holland, on board the Hood, gave the order to close the range and open fire. He knew his ship's deck armor was thin, and his only chance was to get in close, where the German shells would hit his thicker side armor. It was a race against time. The Hood opened fire at a range of 13 miles. But the Bismarck's gunnery was not just good, it was perfect. Its radar-controlled fire direction was the best in the world. The first German salvos were straddles, landing just in front of and just behind the Hood. They had found her range on the first try. The Prince of Wales's guns were already jamming. The Hood's captain, desperate, was ordering a turn, trying to bring his rear guns to bear, when the Bismarck's fifth salvo left the barrels. It was a range of 9 miles. The 1,800-pound armor-piercing shells were arcing high and then plunging down. One of those shells, traveling at over 1,500 miles per hour, hit the Hood, directly on its thin, 3-inch thick afterdeck. It was the 1 in a million shot. The shell didn't explode. It penetrated. It sliced through the thin deck armor, past the crew quarters, past the handling rooms, and plunged deep into the main 4-inch ammunition magazine. At 6:01 a.m., the H.M.S. Hood, the mighty Hood, simply vaporized. A single, colossal, blinding white flash erupted from the center of the ship. A column of fire and smoke shot 1,000 feet into the air. The ship, with 1,118 men on board, was ripped in two. When the smoke cleared, just 3 minutes later, there was nothing left. The pride of the Royal Navy was gone. Out of 1,418 men, there were 3 survivors. The Prince of Wales, its guns jamming, its bridge hit by a 15-inch shell, was now alone. It did the only thing it could. It made smoke, and it ran. In just 8 minutes, the Bismarck had annihilated the most famous warship in the world, and was now undisputed, the master of the Atlantic. But the Bismarck was not unscathed. In those final desperate moments, one of the Prince of Wales's last lucky shots had hit the Bismarck in the bow. It was a critical hit. It had not touched the armor. It had not touched the guns. It had punched a hole in an unarmored forward fuel tank. The invincible monster was now bleeding, a long black trail of oil. The hit on the Bismarck's bow, though it hadn't touched the armor, was a critical war-changing wound. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, the fleet commander aboard the Bismarck, now had 2 impossible problems. First, the hole in the unarmored bow had ruptured a forward fuel tank. The ship was not just leaking oil, it was bleeding it, leaving a massive iridescent black slick on the surface of the Atlantic. This was a 10-mile-long arrow in the ocean, pointing directly at his ship, visible to every British reconnaissance plane. Second, that same shell had severed the lines to another 1,000 tons of fuel, which was now inaccessible. His invincible battleship, which had left port with enough fuel for a 3-month raiding campaign, was suddenly low on gas. The mission to raid the convoys was over. Lutyens had to run for a safe port. He made a fateful decision. He would not, and could not, retrace his path back to Norway, as the entire British home fleet would be waiting for him. He would instead make a desperate dash southeast for the only port on the Atlantic coast that had a dry dock big enough to hold his 50,000-ton monster, the superdocks at Saint-Nazaire in occupied France. But to do this, he first had to shake his pursuers. The British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk were still shadowing him, staying just over the horizon, tracking his every move with their new, secret, and revolutionary weapon, radar. Admiral Lutyens, a brilliant sailor of the old school, hated radar. He didn't trust it. He did know, however, that his own powerful FEMO radar could see the British ships just as they could see him. So in the middle of the night, in a patch of rain and fog, he executed a classic brilliant naval maneuver. He ordered the Bismarck to turn, suddenly, 270 degrees. He would sail directly back at his pursuers. The British cruisers, seeing a 50,000-ton monster charging at them out of the dark, firing its 15-inch guns, did the only thing they could. They panicked. They made smoke to hide themselves, and they scattered to avoid a fight they knew they would lose. It was a brilliant move. In those few crucial minutes of chaos, the Bismarck slipped away, turned southeast, and vanished. At 3:00 a.m. on May the 25th, the Suffolk's radar operator, his eyes raw from staring at the green screen, reported the unthinkable. Contact. Lost. This was, for the Admiralty in London, the moment of absolute complete panic. Their invincible enemy was now a ghost. It was loose in the vast, open Atlantic. It could be heading back to Norway. It could be heading for Spain. Or worst of all, it could be heading directly for the vital, unprotected convoy routes. The entire British home fleet was now in a desperate blind chase. Battleships, carriers, cruisers. Every ship the Royal Navy had, from Gibraltar to Scotland, was ordered to sail at flank speed toward the assumed position of the Bismarck. But they were all guessing. And then, the Bismarck's own arrogance gave them the clue. Admiral Lutyens, a man who was now under immense psychological pressure, made a fatal mistake. Convinced he was safe and wanting to reassure his commanders in Berlin, he broke radio silence. He sent a long, 30-minute, high-frequency radio message to Germany, detailing his victory over the Hood and explaining his minor fuel problem. That 30-minute signal was all the British needed. Radio direction finding stations all over the Atlantic, from Iceland to Ireland, intercepted the message. They took a fix. The fix was crude, but it told the Admiralty one thing. The Bismarck was not going back to Norway. It was heading for France. The hunt was back on. But this good news immediately revealed a new, agonizing, impossible problem. Time. The British Admiralty's plotters, marking the Bismarck's new course and speed, and then marking the positions of their own battleships, felt a cold sickness in their stomachs. The Bismarck, even while bleeding fuel, was still faster than their entire fleet of heavy battleships. The British flagship, the King George V, was pushing its engines to their breaking point, but it was too slow. By their calculations, the Bismarck would reach the safe zone, the area off the French coast protected by the Luftwaffe's dive bombers, in less than 48 hours, and the British fleet was 49 hours away. They were going to lose. They were going to miss it by 1 hour. The Admiralty was desperate. They had only one ship in the entire Atlantic. That was fast enough to get in front of the Bismarck. It was the aircraft carrier, H.M.S. Ark Royal. But what could an aircraft carrier do? Its dive bombers, pea-shooter, 500-pound bombs would just bounce off the Bismarck's 12-inch armor. The Ark Royal had only one long-shot weapon. It had a squadron of biplanes, the Fairey Swordfish. These were, without exaggeration, the most obsolete aircraft in the entire British arsenal. They were biplanes made of canvas and wood. Their crews flew in open, freezing cold cockpits. They were so slow, a 1941 sports car could drive faster than their 130-mile-per-hour top speed. The GIs who saw them would later joke they looked like a collection of spare parts flying in loose formation. This was the impossible weapon that the Royal Navy was now betting the entire war on. The plan was not just risky, it was suicidal. The pilots of the Ark Royal were ordered to fly these slow canvas biplanes. In the middle of a raging North Atlantic gale, find the fastest and most powerful battleship in the world, fly directly into its impenetrable wall of anti-aircraft flak and drop one single torpedo. A torpedo that had to be dropped from just 100 feet above the waves at a speed so slow that the German flak gunners almost couldn't miss. This was the last desperate, 1 in a million gamble. The mission was not just suicidal. It was, at first, a complete and total farce. On the afternoon of May the 26th, the weather in the North Atlantic was not just bad. It was a full-blown force 10 gale. The deck of the H.M.S. Ark Royal was pitching and crashing, rising and falling over 50 feet, a movement so violent that it was throwing aircraft clear off the deck. But they had no choice. At 2:50 p.m., the first wave of 15 Fairey Swordfish biplanes, each loaded with a single 1,600-pound torpedo, took off. It was a miracle of flying skill that they even got into the air. The pilots, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, flew into a wall of black clouds and freezing horizontal rain. They were flying by dead reckoning, their open cockpits filling with seawater. Their brand new primitive ASV, air-to-surface radar, did get a blip. A single large contact, right where the Bismarck was supposed to be. The squadron commander gave the order, attack. The 15 biplanes, the string bags, descended through the clouds. They saw the silhouette of a massive warship, crashing through the waves. This was it. They began their suicidal torpedo run, diving to 100 feet, flying at their top speed of 130 miles per hour, directly at the ship. And then the ship began to flash its signal lamps at them. It was not firing flak, it was flashing. The British recognition signal. In a moment of pure cold-blooded horror, the pilots realized what they had done. This was not the Bismarck. This was the H.M.S. Sheffield, their own cruiser. The Admiralty, in a terrible blunder of communication, had failed to tell the Ark Royal that they had sent the Sheffield ahead to shadow the Bismarck. The attack was a disaster, but this disaster had a miracle hidden inside it. The torpedoes were duds. They were fitted with a brand new, secret, magnetic detonator, just like the Germans were using. They were designed to sense the magnetic field of a ship's hull and explode underneath it, breaking the ship's back. But in the high, crashing seas, 6 of the torpedoes exploded the second they hit the water, and the ones that did run true were dodged in a masterful display of seamanship by the Sheffield's captain. The suicidal attack had failed. The pilots, humiliated, turned their slow canvas biplanes around and flew back to the Ark Royal in shame. It was now late afternoon. The sun was beginning to set. The Bismarck was just a few hours from the safety of the Luftwaffe's air cover. This was it, the absolute final, last chance. The pilots landed on the pitching, heaving deck. They were exhausted, they were freezing, and they had just, almost, killed their friends. But they were also furious, and they now knew that their secret magnetic detonators were useless. They were rearming, and this time the armorers ripped the secret magnetic detonators off and replaced them with the old, reliable Mark II contact detonators. These torpedoes would not explode under the ship. They had to hit it. At 7:10 p.m., in the dying light of the storm, the second wave of 15 Swordfish took off. This was not a mission. This was an execution. They knew they were not all coming back. They flew back to the Sheffield. This time, the Sheffield pointed them in the right direction. Enemy, 12 miles, that way. And then, in the gloom, they found it. The Bismarck. The monster was racing through the 40-foot waves, its 15-inch guns pointing forward, its flak guns, over 100 of them, pointing at the sky. The German lookouts saw them. The sky exploded. The Bismarck disappeared in a solid, impenetrable wall of flak. The tracers, the 20mm, the 37mm, the 105mm, all of it, was firing at once. It was a dome of high explosives. But then, the second impossible miracle happened. The obsolete biplanes were too slow. The Bismarck's state-of-the-art, radar-controlled, computerized anti-aircraft guns were all programmed for fast, modern, 300-mile-per-hour monoplanes. The Swordfish were flying at less than 100 miles per hour. The German computers could not track them. The predictive shells were all exploding in front of the biplanes. The British pilots, in their open cockpits, were flying through the flak wall, untouched. They were too slow to be hit. They descended, one by one, into the suicide zone, 100 feet above the waves, weaving between the 40-foot seas, dodging the waterspouts from the Bismarck's main guns, which were now firing at them. They dropped their torpedoes. One hit the main armor belt and did nothing. Another hit the bow and did nothing. And then, a single Swordfish, number 2P from 820 Squadron, flown by Lieutenant John Moffat, came in from the port stern. He was in the perfect spot. He dropped his torpedo. The torpedo ran true, and at 8:47 p.m., it struck the Bismarck in the one single, one-in-a-million place that had no armor. It hit the stern. It hit the rudder assembly. The explosion was not just a hit. It was the single most catastrophic one-in-a-million shot of the entire naval war. The 1,600-pound torpedo, set to run at a shallow depth, struck the Bismarck's stern. It did not hit the thick 12-inch armor belt. It hit the rudders. The Bismarck had a complex, state-of-the-art dual rudder system. The torpedo's blast, channeled by the water, did not just damage the system. It blasted the port rudder completely off, and it twisted the main starboard rudder, seizing it and jamming it hard. at a 12-degree angle to port. On the bridge of the Bismarck, Admiral Lütjens and his captain, Ernst Lindemann, felt the ship shudder, and then they watched in horror as the wheel died. The ship, which had been racing at high speed toward the safety of France, was now turning. It was turning against its will. It was turning to port. It was turning back into the storm and back toward the oncoming guns of the entire British home fleet. The invincible battleship, the fastest warship in the world, could no longer be steered. The German crew, the finest engineers in the Kriegsmarine, were now in a desperate, frantic race against time. The first logical solution was to steer with the engines. A ship with 3 massive propellers, like the Bismarck, should be able to steer by running one side faster than the other. They tried it. They ran the starboard and center propellers at full power, and the port propeller at low speed. It was useless. At high speed, in a force 10 gale, the weather vaning effect of the wind and the waves, combined with the drag of the jammed 12-degree rudder, was more powerful than the thrust of the engines. The ship just kept turning into the wind. The second solution was to fix the rudder. The chief engineer, his men working in the flooded, dark and chaos-filled stern, reported that the steering compartment was a write-off. It was destroyed. The only way to fix it was from the outside. They formed a team of divers. They would go over the side in the middle of the Atlantic, in a 40-foot wave storm, in the dark, and try to cut the rudder free with underwater welding torches. It was a suicidal, impossible mission. They tried. The men were almost immediately washed overboard or smashed against the steel hull. The mission was aborted. The final, most desperate solution was to blow it off. They sent a team of combat engineers to attach dynamite to the rudder itself from inside the ship to try and blast their own rudder off the ship. They tried. The explosion did nothing except make the flooding worse. It was over. Admiral Lütjens, the man who had just 48 hours earlier been the hunter and the master of the Atlantic, was now a cripple. He was a helpless, blind monster, stuck, turning in a circle, in the middle of the ocean. He knew what was coming. The hounds, the slow old British battleships he had so easily outrun, were now plodding relentlessly toward him. He sent his last fatalistic message to Berlin. It was a message of pure, Gotterdämmerung doom. Ship, unmaneuverable, we will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. Back on the Ark Royal, the obsolete canvas biplanes had all landed. Many were riddled with shrapnel, their canvas wings torn to ribbons. One pilot famously counted 175 holes in his string bag, but they were all safe. Not a single man had been lost. The suicide mission had been a 100% success, and now the British hunters closed in for the kill. The invincible monster was now a sitting duck. All through the long, agonizing night of May 26th, the Bismarck was helpless, turning in slow, uncontrollable circles, battered by the 40-foot waves of the gale. But the British did not let it rest. Admiral Tovey, the British commander, was keeping his own battleships back. He would wait for the clean light of dawn to finish the job. So he sent in the dogs. He ordered Captain Philip Vian, a notoriously aggressive commander, to take his flotilla of 5 tribal-class destroyers and harass the Bismarck all night long. What followed was one of the most brutal and terrifying nights in naval history. Wien's 5 destroyers, led by the H.M.S. Cossack and Zulu, were tiny tin cans compared to the 50,000-ton Bismarck. But they were fast, and they were relentless. They shadowed the Bismarck on their radar, darting in and out of the storm in the pitch-black, freezing rain. The Bismarck's crew, already exhausted and demoralized, could not rest. Every few minutes, a British destroyer would suddenly appear out of the darkness, just a mile away, fire a spread of torpedoes, and then vanish back into the rain. The Bismarck's own massive 15-inch guns would erupt in reply, firing these enormous 1,800-pound shells at a tiny destroyer in the dark. The flak and secondary guns joined in, lighting up the entire horizon in a chaotic, desperate 360-degree fireworks show. But the Bismarck was firing blind. Its legendary, radar-controlled gunnery was now useless. The ship was lurching so violently in the storm and turning so uncontrollably that its computers could not get a firing solution. The German gunners were, in effect, just firing into the noise all night. This continued. The British destroyers, in a stunning display of seamanship, launched 16 torpedoes. They scored no hits, but that was not the point. The point was sleep deprivation. The point was ammunition. The point was terror. By the time the grey, grim dawn of May 27th broke, the crew of the Bismarck was finished. They were at their breaking point. They had not slept in 3 days. They were suffering from severe shell shock from the constant all-night attacks. And most critically, they had fired so many of their secondary and flak shells that they were running dangerously low on ammunition. They were exhausted, they were low on ammo, and they were still stuck in a circle. And then, at 8:43 a.m., on the horizon, they saw them. The hounds had arrived. The British battleships H.M.S. King George V and the H.M.S. Rodney had finally, after a 600-mile chase, caught their prey. This was not a battle. It was an execution. The Rodney, a slow, old World War I veteran, but one that carried massive 16-inch guns, opened fire first. Then the King George V opened fire. The Bismarck tried to fight back. Its forward guns, still operational, fired at the Rodney. The German gunnery, even now, was shockingly good. Its first salvos straddled the Rodney. But the Bismarck could not aim. It was still turning. It could only fire when its circle happened to point its guns at the enemy. The British battleships, however, had no such problem. They just sat calmly outside of the Bismarck's effective range and began, systematically, to demolish it. They fired broadside after broadside. The 16-inch and 14-inch armor-piercing shells began to find their mark. The first hit destroyed the Bismarck's forward superstructure. The next knocked out the main gun director. The brain of the Bismarck was gone. Its guns were now firing local. Another salvo hit A turret and then B turret. The invincible 15-inch guns were silent. The Bismarck was now a helpless, burning wreck. The British battleships, in a cold, brutal, professional rage, moved in closer. They moved to point-blank range, just 2 miles, and they unloaded. They fired over 700 heavy, armor-piercing shells at the Bismarck. The ship was completely, totally annihilated. Its superstructure was a shambles. It was a scrap heap. It was on fire from bow to stern, and yet it would not sink. The German engineers had built a sea fortress, and the fortress was holding. Its armor was so thick that even after this, the single most brutal battleship pounding in history, the hull was still floating. The British battleships were now dangerously low on fuel themselves. They had to leave. Admiral Tovey, in a final act, ordered the cruiser H.M.S. Dorsetshire to finish it. The Dorsetshire moved in to the still floating burning wreck and fired 2 torpedoes into its side. At 10:39 a.m., the invincible Bismarck, the terror of the Atlantic, finally capsized. It rolled over and sank, stern first, into the deep, taking over 2,100 German sailors, including Admiral Lütjens, with it. The greatest hunt in naval history was over. The lifeline to Britain was safe, and the invincible monster had been killed, not by a battleship, but by the impossible 1-in-a-million torpedo, fired from a 130-mile-per-hour canvas biplane. And that concludes this story about the sinking of the Bismarck. If you want to learn more about World War II, subscribe, like, and share. Also, leave your anecdotes and ideas in the comment section.